Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano, and as always, make sure you follow and subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com. Share this episode with your family and friends and on social media. And today I want to talk about something that I think is critically important because nobody else is talking about it. You have some that dance around it, but we are living through a period where once free societies are moving towards authoritarianism, and they're doing this under the guise of combating what they deem as misinformation and disinformation. Now, in a free society, the free flow of information is essential. It's essential to our vitality, and this is something that Americans have understood that it dates back to our founding. Today, though, there is a war being waged on the flow of information. And this war, it's being waged in the name of misinformation. The government, the media industrial complex, higher education, big tech, they're all seeking to control the flow of information at any and all costs to present one narrative. The elites recognize that control of the narrative is essential to power. Republicans are too stupid to understand that. And that's what it's really about. They try to argue that misinformation and disinformation is a threat to civil society. But that's a lie. They know it's a lie. I know it's a lie. You should know it's a lie. As I always say, freedom of speech and freedom of thought are part of the foundation of the American experiment. For 200 plus years, nobody had a problem with this. We praised it. We elevated it. We advertised it to the rest of the world. Yet as platforms began to emerge that elevated the voices of everyday Americans, all of a sudden freedom of speech is now the problem. All of a sudden we're plagued with misinformation and disinformation that could destroy our society. Is our country so weak that we can't withstand this? Did misinformation and disinformation not exist until the emergence of the internet and social media? Of course they're full of it. They had no problems with freedom of speech and thought until it became a challenge to them. That's why you see people like Richard Stengel, a former Obama appointee, deem free speech a design flaw within our system. They say that free speech, it wasn't really what the founders intended. That's all part of your imagination. And so it's up to those in power to control the flow of information. That's how dangerous this has become. Listen to them carefully, I warn you. They tell you exactly what they want to do. And they say that it's essential to control the flow of information to protect us from ourselves. Now, if we translate that into what it really means, what they are saying is that you are too stupid. You're too dumb to understand what's true and what's not. You can't formulate your own opinions. You can't come to your own conclusions. It's rather insulting that they think that we are so ignorant that we don't have the capability to apply reason and logic to the information that exists out there. That we can't observe, analyze, formulate logical conclusions. To them, we need them to drive us toward a particular conclusion. We're just not grateful enough. We don't thank them enough for this. The problem is that while I completely disagree with our overlords and I recognize their true intentions, we have to admit they have been successful. It's not a secret. Not only have they been successful, but they continue to build out a massive apparatus, the all-powerful state, that gets to dictate what you can say, what you can hear, what you could see, and what you can't. Just think about how much they have lied, especially over the last few years. Think about it. I mean, just take a listen to Lord Fauci when he went on Michael Schmierkanish's show on CNN. Take a listen to this.
Brett Stevens in The Times talked about Cochrane. Put that on the screen. The most rigorous and comprehensive analysis of scientific studies conducted on the efficacy of masks for reducing the spread of respiratory illness, including COVID-19, was published last month. Its conclusions, said Tom Jefferson, the Oxford epidemiologist who is the lead author, were unambiguous. There is just no evidence that masks, make any difference. He told the journalist Mayan Demasi, full stop. But wait, hold on. What about the N95 masks as opposed to the lower quality surgical or cloth masks? Makes no difference. None of it, he said. Well, what about the studies that initially persuaded policymakers to impose mask mandates? They were convinced by non-randomized studies, flawed observational studies. How do we get beyond that finding of that particular review?
Yeah, but there are other studies, Michael, that show at an individual level for individual. When you're talking about the effect on the epidemic or the pandemic as a whole, the data are less strong.
Fauci is a real piece of work. You would think that this guy would just go away, just, go creep into a hole. Don't even speak anymore. And if you've been listening to this podcast since the start of COVID, I did episode after episode on the flaws of their policies, how they were lying. I pointed to study after study showing that masks don't work when it comes to influenza-like viruses. They all existed. The reality is that there was plenty of evidence, plenty of studies that existed prior to the coronavirus and how political the response became, yet they pushed it anyway. Now we have new studies that continue to show what many of us already knew, that masks don't work. And what does Fauci say? Well, they only work on an individual level, not on a societal level. Think about the damage this little twerp inflicted on our society. And now he's saying, well, we knew that masks didn't work on a societal level. It's only, to protect the individual. If the individual wants to wear it, no big deal. That was information that could have been provided 3 years ago. How much damage did we do? Not for nothing. You would think it would be nice if these people would just come out, admit that they royally effed up, apologize, and went away. However, Fauci's ego won't allow him to do that. And all these people should be held accountable, but they won't. They're all frauds. They should be held accountable, but they're part of a protected class. It really is amazing. You have schools right now forcing students to wear masks. Yes, schools are actually bringing back these mask mandates, even after everything that we know today. Remember, follow the science. I told you then, and I will say it again and again and again. Follow the science isn't really follow the science. It's follow the science that they are pushing. That's the science that you need to follow. And everything they did to control the flow of information, everything they did, they could care less about the science. It's about power. And their actions have proven that. We just witnessed how one sector, the public health sector, did extraordinary damage to this country by using a crisis and controlling the flow of information. And then you look at New York State. It's amazing. An official came out the other day and stated that they're not looking to reimpose mask mandates. Now, that's a good thing. I celebrate that. But it's important to know why they aren't issuing mask mandates. It's not because of the science. It's not because of the Cochrane study. It's not because masks have been proven to be ineffective. The reason they won't issue mandates is because they said that the majority of people wouldn't comply. They actually said that out loud. Think about that a second. That they're not going to issue a mandate. And if it was so successful and protected us so well, they're not going to issue the mandate because the majority of people wouldn't comply. And they don't want to be embarrassed. That's what it comes down to. See, mandates don't exist if people don't follow them. And I stated that time and time again. That should have been the case during the first go-around. All you had to do was not comply. Mandates would have gone away immediately. But when it comes to the idea of misinformation and disinformation, there is something that is much more sinister afoot. And I'm going to talk about that when we get back from this quick break. P.A.S. report listeners, our government is out of control. Criminal tax hikes, hyperinflation, a full-blown recession. It's part of the grand plan. The billions of dollars Biden keeps sending to the corrupt government in Ukraine, the trillions in new taxes he wants to shove down your throat, the electronic banking system crash that resets everyone to zero, checking accounts, saving accounts, 401ks, IRAs, all of it, zero. But you don't have to be a victim. Protect your money and get up to $10,000 in free silver to do it when you call Goldco. Goldco's helped protect over $2 billion in gold and silver for people like you and me. They're offering you up to $10,000 in bonus silver when opening a qualified IRA account just for being a supporter of the P.A.S. report. So whether you want to protect 50 grand or $500,000 or more, this is your opportunity to protect yourself from our out-of-control government. Don't be a victim and call Goldco today. 855-656-0196, 855-656-0196, or go to goldco.com/PAS report. Welcome back, everyone. So what we are witnessing is that it goes much deeper than people imagine. See, when it comes to the abuses of power, everyone treats examples as if they're separate and distinct from each other, but they're not. They're not. You look at Russian collusion scam, that's one bucket. COVID is another bucket. January 6th is another bucket. The DOJ school board memo targeting parents is another bucket. The disinformation governance board targeting Catholics, so on. They make it as all these things are separate from each other. However, these aren't separate incidents. The truth of the matter is that this is a well-organized, coordinated effort that all ties back to the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism, and there hasn't been a single congressional hearing about this document. Remember what I told you last week. There are many Republicans that believe in support in the big government apparatus. They agree with it. In the words of Chris Christie, they believe in expanding the interests of government over the interests of America and we the people. He made it abundantly clear. And there's a lot of Republicans that actually think the same way, that are in elected positions. So I can't believe that we haven't had a single hearing on the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism that was released in June of 2021, because it really reshaped a lot of the missions that exist. And I find it shocking how conservative and Republican commentators, they never talk about the national strategy, even though it is one of the biggest threats to the fabric of our country. That does surprise me. The politicians never surprise me. I'm used to them. But the commentators do surprise me, especially when they are constantly touting the ideas of liberty and freedom and limited government. Now, I've spoken about this document at length. I've spoken about how wide of a net this document casts because of its vagueness, using non-defined terms like anti-government or anti-authority sentiment, stating that anyone that is engaged in incitement, which they never define how someone engages in incitement. Is it just a tweet someone puts out there? They don't define those things. They say that it's all based on perception of government overreaching. Well, who gets to decide whether government's overreaching or not? Well, they do. They're the ones that get to decide, not you. But look at the timeline. I've been harping on this document because it's that damn important. And if you look at the timeline, you begin to see how everything is connected. This document released in June of 2021. But if anyone knows anything about government, these documents take time to develop. The foundations were being laid even before Biden took office. Now, once the document was issued, just take a look about how domestic terrorism investigations nearly tripled. They went from about 1,000 per year to 2,700 domestic terrorism investigations per year. That's not normal. You don't see these types of jumps. There is no doubt that the numbers are being inflated. The surge we are witnessing isn't really due to an increase of domestic terrorism. It's not due to the threat of domestic terrorism. It's due to how the national strategy for countering domestic terrorism actually lowers the threshold of what constitutes a domestic extremist. And this allows the investigations to be manipulated. So take something like January 6th. In years past, January 6th would be considered one domestic terrorism investigation. Wouldn't matter if it was just one person involved or 10 people, 100 people, 1,000 people. Wouldn't matter. It's still one investigation. However, they now count every single individual as its own domestic terrorism investigation to boost the numbers. Think about it logically. It's not a coincidence that shortly after the national strategy was released, that domestic terrorism investigations nearly tripled, and they actually continue to grow. And not for nothing. But when you look at the numbers, we probably had over 10,000 domestic terrorism investigations over the last decade. Isn't anyone going to ask the obvious question? Where are all the rest? With that many investigations, I mean, we should be bombarded with arrests on the television screen of people being perp walked and charged with domestic terrorism-related offenses, right? It's bizarre that we have all these investigations, but we don't see too many arrests. And if it was all these right-wing fanatics getting arrested, all these MAGA people getting arrested, don't you think you'd be seeing those stories each and every day on MSNBC and CNN playing on a loop, constantly being beamed and projected into homes across America, if anyone watches those networks? So understand, the national strategy gets issued, domestic terrorism investigations nearly triple. In September, so it's issued in June, in September, the Biden administration warns that those who don't comply with their totalitarian decrees of vax mandates are creating a dark winter of death and despair, and that the dear leader and his administration, his patience is wearing thin. It's important to keep that in mind. I'll get back to that a little bit later. Now, in September, a few weeks after Biden's announcement that he's getting annoyed with everyone, we witnessed the White House and the Department of Education collude with the National School Boards Association. They requested that the Department of Justice investigate parents under the Patriot Act because parents had the audacity to raise concerns about what their children were learning and being indoctrinated with. Parents had the audacity to push back against mask policies and vax mandates. How dare them do that? How dare they do that? Within a week of that, the first week of October, the Attorney General issued the now infamous DOJ memo that allowed the investigation into parents to begin, despite the fact that there was literally no evidence to support this memo. There was no evidence showing that we saw increased threats at school boards. FBI Director Christopher Wray testified exactly that. And he admitted it in his congressional testimony. So it's not me saying it. It's the FBI director saying that he saw no evidence that justified that memo. Yet, they still created a threat tag system now, didn't they? Even though Wray stated the evidence was lacking, that there was never any present to justify the memo, the FBI Counterterrorism Criminal Divisions Unit created a new threat tag system to monitor what was going on at school boards. That was October. 3 months later, January of 2022, the Department of Justice announced the creation of a new domestic terrorism unit. Here's the interesting thing. We still don't know a lot about what this unit really does. We don't know a lot about what they're really investigating. We have no idea. You would think we would have a branch of government with the power of oversight that would ask these questions. But of course, most of the elected representatives, they don't seem too interested in this, right? And I'm talking about both Democrats and Republicans. Shouldn't we know more about this new creation of a domestic terrorism unit? And what authority did they have from Congress, which does have the power of oversight, to create this new unit? Interesting. 3 months after that, April 2022, you have the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas announced the creation of the Disinformation Governance Board, basically a ministry of truth. Yeah, let's give government even more control over the flow of information. Now, in full disclosure, there was an enormous amount of backlash. Mayorkas announced he was disbanding the ministry. But understand, while they were disbanding the Disinformation Governance Board, it doesn't mean that it was going away. They're just rebuilding it and rebranding it under the guise of something else. Again, I'll get to that one later too. Throughout the summer of 2020, notice how the rhetoric of the Biden administration and Democrats in the media began to change, especially the President of the United States. They increasingly linked anyone who supports the former president or identifies as MAGA as an extremist. And this culminated in President Biden's dark and dictatorial speech, right? Where he was standing outside Independence Hall with the blood-red lights, the Marines, 2 Marines flanking him, when he declared that MAGA Republicans are intent on, quote, destroying democracy and represent an extremism that threatens the very foundations of our republic.
Come on, give me a break, man.
In that dark and dictatorial speech, he went on to say that this is the greatest threat. MAGA Republicans are the greatest threat since our founding. Talk about hyperbole. Now, that wasn't by accident, it's by design, especially considering that we all know the president can't write his own speeches. He just reads what's on the teleprompter. They give him a shot of B12 or something else, who knows, maybe Hunter Biden's stash. But it's not a coincidence that the rhetoric changed. And then you see the 4 indictments against the former president. So now imagine if the president's convicted and you still support him. You're supporting a convicted felon who's intent on destroying democracy. Think about that logically. Fast forward to February of this year, where the FBI's Virginia field office developed a product declaring that traditional Catholics may be domestic violent extremists and that parishes must be infiltrated. Catholic parishes, Catholic churches have to be infiltrated to determine the extent of the threat. And then you had FBI Director Wray testify that it was one field office and that he rescinded the memo as soon as he found out about it. He was disgusted by it. But we know that's not true, right? Because it turned out multiple field offices actually were doing this. And it wasn't just in Virginia. It was in California. It was in Washington. Open your eyes. Pay attention to what's going on. These aren't separate incidents with separate outcomes. This is an organized campaign that fundamentally alters the United States. And when we get back from this short break, I am going to tie everything together. So hang tight. P.A.S. Report listeners, hurricane season is almost here, and the time to prepare is right now, not when the hurricane hits. When Hurricane Ida hit the Gulf Coast, it destroyed countless homes and left many without access to food and clean water. Millions lost power, some for weeks. The floods that followed the hurricane washed out roads, made it impossible for grocery stores to restock their shelves. Families were desperate. They were waiting for help that was slow to arrive. But what if you didn't have to rely on FEMA to provide for your family during a crisis? The answer is simple. Be prepared with emergency food kits from 4 Patriots. Their long-lasting and delicious food options are specifically designed to provide you and your loved ones with the sustenance you need when you need it most. And these food kits are hand-packed in the USA, last up to 25 years, compact inside covert storage totes, include a wide variety of delicious breakfasts, lunches, and dinners, and they're backed by thousands of 5-star customer reviews. 4 Patriot survival food is not just for natural disasters. In today's world of uncertain supply chains and unpredictable emergencies, it's more important than ever to have a backup plan. Whether it's temporary power outage, a winter blizzard, rising food costs, you can rest easy knowing that you have a reliable source of food to see you through. And right now, you go to 4patriots.com, use code P.A.S. to get 10% off your first purchase on anything in the store, including the emergency food supply kits that are designed to last up to 25 years. Just go to 4patriots.com, use code P.A.S. to get 10% off your first purchase of 4 Patriot survival food. Welcome back, everyone. And so looking at the national strategy, this idea of control of the information, the flow of information, the Biden administration, they actually provided an update on the White House website about the national strategy for countering domestic terrorism and how it's been successful in weakening domestic terrorism throughout the United States. And they point to a few key things that I just want to take a look at. Now, if you read the national strategy, I encourage everyone to read it. Always do. It's about 31, 32 pages. Under Pillar 1 of the national strategy, you'll see that the private sector is being co-opted because the administration and the government feel that they are the first to identify a potential threat. And that information sharing is essential. The document, the national strategy, says they want private corporations to identify early threats by what the report deems as credible non-governmental analysis. Okay, essentially, they're giving these companies software to try and track the consumers. And they want corporations, the tech sector, the financial industry, they want them to serve as the eyes and ears of government. This is nothing more than a backdoor attempt to spy on ordinary Americans and bypass the warrant process. That's what it really is. And so in this new update, President Biden had a section that engaging the private sector to enlist their help in our response to the threat posed by domestic terrorists. And they say departments and agencies have developed new information sharing and technical assistance mechanisms that respond to requests from technology, financial, and other private sector actors to better understand the threat posed by domestic terrorism. But it's not just corporations. It's also non-governmental organizations. This includes leftist organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center. I warned everyone back in June of 2021 when this document first came out. I actually mentioned the Southern Poverty Law Center, and I warned about them specifically. Well, what do we know today about this partnership between the Southern Poverty Law Center and the government? Well, we know that the Virginia product that was developed to target Catholics was mostly based on information from the Southern Poverty Law Center. You see how that works? The SPLC does the bidding of the administration. The administration and the government justify targeting certain groups of people based on the SPLC's analysis. Think about that logically. It's kind of circular if you think about it. Now you have the Southern Poverty Law Center declaring Moms for Liberty as an anti-government extremist organization. This should disturb anyone and everyone, considering how the national strategy states that anyone who expresses anti-government or anti-authority sentiment has the potential to be deemed an extremist, a domestic terrorist. Now, here's a key thing with the national strategy. They never define anti-government or anti-authority sentiment. I've spoken about that before. But there is something important to know. If you look at older Department of Homeland Security or FBI documents, you're going to see the words violent anti-government, violent anti-authority extremists. Understand, they dropped the word violent, they took out the word extremist and replaced it with sentiment. Do you think that was an accident? Again, it's meant to broaden the net of the people that could be caught up under the national strategy, to justify it. When we look at Pillar 2, that starts on page 19, it discusses the need to, quote, prevent individuals from being drawn into the grip of domestic terrorism in the first instance, end quote. Now, if you're just an ordinary person, you want to examine how they intend to do that, well, you don't need to read too much further, because the first thing that should jump out at you is where the document reads about reducing supply and demand of recruitment materials by limiting widespread availability online. What they're talking about is widespread censorship. That's what it comes down to. And all you have to do is turn back to page 10, you'll find it there, where they discuss what motivates domestic violent extremists. They point to narratives. It's narratives. And it's all right-wing narratives, never left-wing narratives, because they don't engage in misinformation and disinformation. Now, logic would say that in order to prevent individuals from being drawn in, you have to prevent narratives from taking shape. Thereby, you have to control the information of what people see and what people hear. Long before the Twitter files became public, long before that, I warned that they want to empower Google and the social media giants to go on a widespread censorship blitz. And the Twitter files validated everything I said. But it's not just the tech sector. It's bad, don't get me wrong. But it's other sectors as well. We see the government and the tech sector coordinating talking points, determining who can say what, when they could say it. And when they talk about the flow of information, this was part of the national strategy update that Biden gave a few weeks ago, addressing the role of the internet in influencing individuals to commit acts of domestic terrorism. the administration has continued to participate in non-governmental and multilateral efforts to understand and respond to terrorist content and activities online. Department of Justice, National Institute of Justice has prioritized funding of research focused on the role of social media platforms in promoting and countering violent extremist content and information. Department of Homeland Security has also funded more than 24 grants supporting these programs. And this brings me to higher education, because that's what they're talking about. We are seeing more and more colleges offering classes on misinformation and disinformation. Boston University's latest hire illustrates that it's not about intellectual exploration anymore. It's not about open debate. Joan Donovan is now going to be teaching courses on misinformation and disinformation, and Boston University describes her as, quote, one of the foremost experts in misinformation, disinformation, and media manipulation. Now, on several occasions, Donovan has openly stated that manipulation and disinformation are part of the right-wing agenda being pushed by the right-wing media ecosystem. Those are her words. And it serves as an existential threat to democracy. There you go again, threat to democracy. See, apparently misinformation only exists on the right, not the left-wing media ecosystem. They never engage in misinformation. That Russian collusion thing, everything they told us during COVID and the authoritarian mandates, 2020 being the safest and most secure election, that's all a figment of the imagination. Hunter Biden's laptop being Russian disinformation, it was all in your head. Those things really didn't happen because, according to her, the government, MSNBC, CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, they never engage in misinformation or disinformation. They don't manipulate narratives to serve any interests. They're just honest reporters. They're honest journalists. They're not political activists trying to push DNC talking points. And if you think they do, well, you're a right-wing tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist that is expressing anti-government and anti-authority sentiment. You see how that works? See, she expresses her support for content moderation, which is nothing more than a veiled form of censorship, and she believes that governments and government regulation, well, that's the solution to stamping out misinformation and disinformation. She said, quote, "The reason that we have governments and so many of them is so things like this cannot happen," end quote. She stated how, quote, "a strengthened academia acting as the critical and conscience of society is an important backstop," end quote, when it comes to misinformation and disinformation. This is critical because as higher education builds out these censorship tools, understand that the government is going to justify the censorship. They're going to say, well, we weren't doing the censoring. It's the academics that deemed something as misinformation, not the government. And if the academics deemed it as misinformation, it must be true because they're smart people. Listen, left-leaning ideologues on college campuses, that's nothing new. They've dominated college campuses for decades. It's not surprising. But the recent and troubling development is in the fact that we see this active approach to stifle information, curtail debate, cultivate groupthink, promote the government's narrative. That's what we see. I warned, and I will continue to warn, about the alliance between government and academia that's going to further advance the erosion of intellectual freedom, of diverse perspectives, freedom of thought. The Biden administration isn't lying when they say they funded grants to address the role of the internet in influencing individuals. Millions upon millions of taxpayer dollars, our own money, is being used to silence our own voices. And there are multiple colleges involved. You have the University of Wisconsin that was awarded a $5 million grant by the National Science Foundation to develop a system that can detect and strategically correct what the government perceives as misinformation relating to COVID, elections, and vaccines. This new grant is on top of $7.5 million grant awarded by the National Science Foundation to 10 universities to develop anti-misinformation tools. It's part of the Trust and Authenticity in Communication Systems Initiative. You got to love the titles they come up with. Under the Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Grant Program, you have 2 Syracuse University professors receiving $600,000 taxpayer dollars to seek solutions to the plague of disinformation. A professor at the University of Dayton secured over $352,000 under the same program, and in his grant application, he labeled Fox News, the Heritage Foundation, the Christian Broadcasting Network as the initial sources of right-wing extremism. PragerU, Turning Point USA, they're just one level below neo-Nazi organizations. That's how demented these fools are. And it's amazing because these are supposed to be academics. These are supposed to be really smart people. Understand that just because someone has a PhD, it does not make them smart. Okay? I know a hell of a lot of people that have PhDs that aren't too bright out there. Yet a guy that has a construction company has a lot more intelligence. All these smart people in academia, they tend to ignore the fact that the largest purveyors of misinformation and disinformation throughout history have been governments, including our own. Remember the Gulf of Tonkin? Or what about WMDs in Iraq? Don't forget about Russian collusion. What about when James Clapper and John Brennan openly lied to Congress, committing perjury, said, oh, the government, we would never spy and collect information on ordinary Americans. We wouldn't do that, not wittingly. Remember when they told us that the Patriot Act wouldn't be used to target American citizens? All lies. Just think about throughout the pandemic. We were inundated with misinformation and disinformation. From who? From the public health sector, from the government itself. You had doctors and scientists that were criticizing the mandates. You just didn't hear them because their voices were silenced. They were censored. Even though they actually turned out to be right and the official government narrative was wrong. And there are so many demented sheep out there that none of them thought to question the idea of putting masks on kids, right? We were one of the only countries that put masks on children 12 years old and younger. Most other countries, including ones that were fairly strict, did not mask their kids. Most other countries never shut down their schools. Look at the damage that these frauds created here in the United States and understand it's going to be decades before we recover from the damage that they cause. Wake up, people. You have to wake up out there. And I implore every single one of you out there, contact every member of Congress in the House and the Senate. Doesn't matter if they're in your district or not. Doesn't matter if they're your representative or not. You should contact every member of the House, every member of the Senate. We should be having hearings on the national strategy. The officials should be placed under oath and asked how the national strategy has changed agency missions, how they've used it in practice in their everyday operating manuals. They need to be asked those questions. It's a policy that needs to be immediately rescinded. The government is right now successfully building out the mass surveillance state, and the national strategy is fully operational. I'm not sure what more it will take for the American people to wake up, and I'm not sure how much more evidence people need to see. It's clear as day. It's in front of our face. Too many are acting as willing instruments for political propaganda, and it is dangerous. They constantly preach about threats to democracy. They're the biggest threat to our republic. The biggest threat. A free and healthy society requires a diversity of opinions and perspectives. It requires free speech. It requires robust public debates. Not trying to silence someone. Freedom of speech is easy when it's only speech you agree with. The whole point of freedom of speech is speech you disagree with, speech that may be disgusting. You may not like it. It may be hateful and nasty. But that's what free speech is all about. How much longer do you think we're going to be a free society if the government is controlling the flow of information? How much longer? We're losing it faster than you could imagine, and it's time that we break free from the suffocating grip that the government has exerted throughout our society. It's time that we take back the narratives. You may not be right in expressing your opinion, but you have every right to express your opinion. And it's not up to me, it's not up to any college professor, it's not up to the government to dictate what opinions are approved and which ones are unapproved. Try and back up what you say with evidence and facts. But don't let anyone ever tell you that you can't have your own thoughts and opinions. Don't let anyone ever tell you that you can't take certain political positions. If that's the road we're going down, the free society is gone. It doesn't exist. And hopefully we'll come to our senses before it's too late. Now, if you found the content of this episode informative, please give it a 5-star rating and take 30 seconds to write a review on any podcast platform that allows it. Also, share this episode with your family and friends and on social media, and visit the P.A.S. Report website, PASreport.com. I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll be back next week with another fantastic episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.